And now we're very happy to welcome Emily Wells. She received her undergraduate degree from Michigan State University with a Bachelor of Science in Clinical Dietetics, and she completed a 10-month clinical focused internship at University of Michigan Hospital. Let's go blue. She obtained her master's degree at Grand Valley State University in clinical dietetics in 2019. She is currently a visiting professor at Grand Valley State University, working with graduate students in the clinical dietetics program and the applied food and nutrition program. Without further ado, Emily, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Can you all hear me okay? Okay, great. Well, thank you for having me. Have any of you seen me speak here before? I spoke in the past, last year or the year before, on brain health and aging. So I'm really excited to be back to talk about a slightly different topic. I was asked to speak about ultra processed foods because there's been a lot of conversation, there's been a lot of media talk about this topic. So I'm excited to talk about this. This also allowed me to dive into some of the research a little bit further. And I went to another presentation where I was able to hear from some researchers in that specific field. So I am excited to present this information to you and bring this all to you. The title of the talk today is Nutrition, the More You Know, the More You Can Control. And this is two parts. So today we're going to dive into a little bit of the research of ultra processed foods and some of the conversation around that and how kind of I view that as a dietitian. And then next week, we're going to talk about food labels and label reading and kind of what's on our labels and what we need to know about that. And I'm going to have some homework for you at the end of today's presentation for next week. There's no grades, but I am a professor at Grand Valley, so I have to do some homework. So I wanted to start today to talk a little bit about my nutrition philosophy. There are a lot of nutrition professionals out there. As a registered dietitian, my degrees are specifically in nutrition, but there are other people who may claim to have had some training in nutrition or may consider themselves a nutritionist. Dietitians have the kind of top level of nutrition training, but we all vary. All dietitians have kind of a different approach to food, a different background knowledge in food. My clinical practice experience is in diabetes, eating disorders, and mental health. So a lot of my nutrition perspective really aligns with an all foods fit type of approach. And you'll hear that really kind of infused as I talk today. And what I mean by that is truly what it sounds like, that all foods have some sort of place in our lives. Of course, this doesn't include foods that we are allergic to or we don't like or have some sort of adverse effect for us. But many foods that get negative press or negative information or are foods that we may consider a bad food may have a place in our diets. So that's my all foods fit. I also have a neutral nutrition perspective. So there's a lot of discussion about food that is a kind of a removal process, right? I can't eat that. I need to remove that. This is on a list of a do not eat because of this diagnosis or that diagnosis. So my neutral nutrition is very kind of in the gray area, in the middle, right? That we can remove some foods if we need to, but we also can add foods back and we can really find a balance between all of the foods that we should and could eat. With that goes with some balance and intuitiveness, understanding what our body needs, when it needs it, and having a good awareness of our body's cues is a really big part of my nutrition philosophy as well. And then fact-based language and nutrition information. That's really what's going to inform our conversation today is what are the facts that are available with ultra processed foods and how does that apply to nutrition? I think that that's the biggest message that I'll bring for you today is we're talking about processing, and I'm going to teach you a little bit about that. But then also we want to look at how this impacts our actual nutritional value of the foods that we're taking in. So that's a little bit about me. As you can tell, I'm having a baby in May, so I'm a little out of breath. So if you hear me stopping and catching my breath a little bit, that's why, because she's pushing up on my lungs a little bit. They're smaller than they usually are. Okay, so let's dive in and talk about ultra processed foods. There's a lot out there. I wanted to pull a little bit of media headlines and what we're kind of seeing out there. So the news about food section here was from a quick Google News search of ultra processed foods. So you can see that there's a lot of controversy and there's a lot of discussion about these foods. Ultra processed foods make up 70% of the US food supply. Ultra processed food is too broad a term to be useful. How does it impact our heart health? 5 days of ultra processed food. Studies find that's enough to alter insulin and reward function in the brain. Toxic food. As the media does, as we see in headlines, these are very attention grabbing and intense words that we're using. Something like toxic when we're talking about food that is a basic life requirement can be kind of jarring, right? Especially on the cover of a magazine like this. But you can also see that there's some conflicting information. Can we use ultra processed food as a term? Is it truly making up 70% of our food supply, and what does that mean? Does it impact our heart health? Does it impact our insulin levels? But if we can't use that term, how can we apply it to insulin levels? There's a lot of confusion, as is true with nutrition in general. There's often a lot of confusion. The other image that I have up here, I really liked a lot because it shows the comparison that's often made between what we would kind of consider processed foods and what we would consider whole unprocessed foods, right? And there's not a lot of in between, right? We're looking at donuts and popcorn and French fries and chicken nuggets and some of these things that there's no doubt are highly processed, but also do not have a lot of nutritional value. When we look at the other side, there's no doubt that foods like avocados and apples and grapes have a lot of nutritional value and aren't processed because they're natural whole foods. But what about those things that are in the middle? What about our canned and frozen foods? What about our dairy products? What about some of our slightly processed meat or something like deli meat that has a lot of nutritional value, has a lot of protein and calcium and vitamin D, some of this nutritional value. So again, like I mentioned earlier, the information that I'm going to present is tying some of the concern and confusion about processing with nutrition and what we want to look at when we're considering our choices with food. I always like to bring media into my presentations because this is what we're seeing and this is what is sparking conversation. I saw an article today, or I read, my husband the other day was like, I read that our tap water that we're drinking has all these things in it. But where's the research coming from? What's informing some of these conversations and some of these headlines? Which was really interesting because I recently had my students do a discussion board where they looked at a nutrition related posts from a dietitian, and one of them was about water, and the dietitian was recommending these very expensive water purifying systems that actually don't have a lot of research supporting them. And so I thought it was interesting that my husband is a first grade teacher. He's not a science person at all. That kind of he read an article about that maybe was at New York Times or Yahoo News or something that popped up. And then I had my students doing some investigative work on, and they decided to do a similar topic. So it just kind of shows that there's so much media out there that kind of informs the average person, but then the research doesn't always support that, which is why I'm here to talk about this. Okay, so ultra processed foods is this new term that we're hearing, not just processed or unprocessed. Now we've kind of expanded on that into the ultra processed. And so I want to give you a little bit of background of where that term comes from. This is the NOVA food classification system. And this was developed for researchers to identify their foods or classify their foods. There's 4 groups that the NOVA food classification system breaks them down. And we're going to go through these a little bit in detail today, but I want to give you this overview. So the first one is group 1. This is unprocessed or minimally processed foods. So these are foods from nature with inedible parts removed. Many of these are going to be fruits and vegetables, but I'm going to show you a whole list and we'll talk about some of these. Group 2 are processed culinary ingredients. So these are foods from group 1 in a different form. An example of this may be a seed oil, like let's say sesame seed oil. Sesame seeds are the food from nature that are just the inedible parts are removed, the stems or, if it has a hull or whatnot. And then group 1, that sesame seed is then pressed into an oil. Okay, so still considered minimally processed, but even when we go out of group 1, there's some level of processing that's happening. And this is always the message that I would share with people when talking about processed food is a lot of our food, in order for it to be consumed, has to go through some level of processing, right? So that's group 1 and 2. Group 3 is just considered a processed food. And so this is when we see a combination of group 1 and group 2. And then we may also be adding something like salt or sugar or a fat, oil, or using a preservation method like canning or bottling. Okay. So this may be something like canned beans that have salt added to them and then are canned for preservation. You'll notice that freezing is not on here because typically freezing, nothing is added. So that maintains the processing in that unprocessed or minimally processed. But bottling and canning has a procedure that's part of it. Okay, so that's group 3. And then group 4 is what's considered our ultra processed foods. So these are industrially manufactured food products that are made of several ingredients or formulations and food substances that have no or rare culinary use. So these are industrial use ingredients, probably more commonly known as something like an additive or preservative, something that maintains the quality and structure of the food to make it shelf stable or to make it longer lasting than maybe a whole fruit. We maybe make it into something like applesauce that has citric acid that would maintain its color. That would be considered an ultra processed food because citric acid is not something that we just buy. We don't have citric acid just laying around at our houses. We can buy it, but typically we're not. So that's an example of an ultra processed food, which will also start to give you a little bit of insight into, wait a second, I thought these were ultra processed foods, right? These donuts and chicken nuggets and French fries. Where does applesauce fit into this? Applesauce is top of my mind because my son is too, and applesauce is, one of his staple foods that we have in our house. But it's something to think about that we have one additional ingredient that's added that makes it considered a group 4 food. Okay, so this is the NOVA classification system. And this is where the discussion among researchers comes in, that this is not easy to follow. There's a lot of nuances to this. There's a lot of interpretation that can happen with this classification system. And research that's being done on ultra processed food varies. Every researcher is not able to interpret these guidelines exactly the same. So this is where we start to see some differences among research studies and research articles that are coming out. Another thing that kind of I found from the presentation that I was able to listen to is that there are very few controlled studies, randomized controlled studies that are done related to ultra processed foods. So when we talk about that, that means that we have a control group, and we have another group that has some interventions that are done. It's really, really difficult to do randomized controlled studies with nutrition because all of the food has to be controlled. There's actually very few of them that are done because it doesn't replicate real life. Having all of your food given to you by a team or in a lab doesn't represent real life and the other factors that are going on when it comes to nutrition. It's another topic, I guess, that I could talk about. But there's only 1 or 2 studies on ultra processed foods that are considered randomized controlled studies. The rest of them are very small evidential studies or anecdotal studies of observation. Okay, so we're going to use this guideline to kind of inform us a little bit about our processed foods and what is considered a processed food. First one we will talk about are completely unprocessed. So this is the group that just the inedible parts are removed. So some of this I mentioned, we're going to see fruits and vegetables, potatoes, roots, tubers. Those are going to be kind of that first category there. But you will see natural, packaged, cut, chilled, or frozen are all considered this unprocessed group 1. Then we have nuts, peanuts, other seeds I mentioned. Grains like brown rice, white rice, corn kernels, wheat berries, any types of herbs or spices, fruit juices with no added sugar, fresh and pasteurized. It's also interesting because pasteurization is a form of processing. Of course, it's a safety measure, right? But it is a form of processing. Fresh and dried mushrooms, other types of grains, wheat, oat, other cereals, which may be something like if we're using cream of wheat or oatmeal, I guess those are wheat and oatmeal, but others that would be similar. Grits, flakes, and flours made from corn, wheat, and oats. And then we have fresh, chilled, or frozen meat, poultry, fish, seafood that are in whole form. This is one that starts to get a little bit nuanced, right? Of well, what if we add salt to it? What if we have some sort of preservative added? That's where it starts to kind of climb into those different groups. Dried or fresh pasta, fresh and pasteurized milk, any yogurt, plain yogurt without sugar, eggs, tea, lentils, chickpeas, beans, coffee, dried fruit, tap, spring, and mineral water. So these are a lot of foods that I recommend as a dietitian, of course, right? Whole fruits and vegetables, lean meats and proteins, unsweetened dairy, eggs, whole grains, right? A lot of foods that I would never deny are foods that we want to include on a regular basis. But the reason that I recommend these foods is because of their nutritional value, right? These foods have all of the macro and micronutrients that we're looking for. They have protein and carbohydrates and healthy fats, fiber, vitamins and minerals, calcium, all of these things that are essential for life. But I don't necessarily recommend them because they are unprocessed, because we can take some of these same products and process them in a way that maintains their nutritional value, but just makes it a little bit easier for us to obtain and cook and consume. So if we go into the second group, the second group is I think of it as kind of an additional group, right? These are not things that we necessarily are going to eat by themselves, but we're often going to add them to something else. And that's what gives us our group 3. So this is going to be our oils, like I mentioned, butter, white, brown, and other types of sugar, lard, honey, coconut fat, syrup from maple trees, salts, that one should be in a different level, starches from corn and other plants, and then any of the foods that are combined. So something that like salted butter, right? Salt and butter are combined. Those would be in there as well. Or if you have some sort of combination of like maple syrup and brown sugar type of thing, that would be considered group 2. So I think that this is interesting too, because group two has a lot of foods that I would not necessarily consider highly nutritious foods, right? We're looking at salt, we're looking at butter and oil and sugar, but they are minimally processed, right? They're coming from whatever the pure plant is. If we think about sugar coming from sugar beets or sugar cane and being processed into the sugar that we are familiar with. So minimally processed doesn't necessarily mean that it is a health food or nutritious for you. I have another story that I'll share. My mom sent me a New York Times, I don't know, quiz, I guess, with an article that was about ultra processed foods. And it had you go through, a series of questions that had you pick the least processed food. And one of them was ice cream. My mom is a huge ice cream fanatic, expert. And so we were going through, and really what it came down to is the product that had the least ingredients, which ended up being a Haagen-Dazs ice cream that had milk and cream and sugar and vanilla, and that was it. She was like, I'm so glad that's the healthiest. And I was like, Mom, that's not how it works. Has the least amount of ingredients doesn't mean that it's a health food, right? And so this is when you start to think about some of the considerations of choosing foods and what's important to us, right? Ice cream, in one sense, ice cream is ice cream is ice cream, right? It's a food that we shouldn't eat all the time. It's not one of our staple foods or, a highly nutritious food, but that doesn't mean we can't eat it or shouldn't eat it. We want to eat it in moderation, of course. But it doesn't necessarily have to be the least processed version for it to be the best or better. So I don't have the right answer for you. I can't tell you which you should do, but there are just considerations to keep in mind. Okay, so this is the second group. This is not to say that Haagen-Dazs isn't one of the best ice creams out there either. Right. Okay, so here's group three. So group three, this is where we are considered a processed food, right? We're not quite into the ultra processed food category yet, but we are a processed food. So this is where we're getting into some of our canning, where we're adding salt or we're adding vinegar. We're maybe doing a brine or pickling. We have canned fish with or without preservatives, tomato extract, or paste or concentrated, right? So things that are taken from their original form and then they're starting to be processed into a different form. Salt, dried, smoked, or cured meat. So this is where like some of our deli meat may be added, fruits and sugar syrup, coconut fat, beef jerky, freshly made cheeses, bacon, freshly made unpackaged bread. So made from wheat flour, yeast, water, and salt. You'll notice that some of the bread that we get at like the grocery store will have some additional preservatives in it. Salted or sugared nuts and seeds, fermented alcohol beverages, beer, cider, wine. There's a variety of foods within this list, right? Where when we start to talk about nutrition, we have some, yes, some of these foods are going to be staple foods, things like canned vegetables or different types of dried, smoked, cured meats, maybe cheese, maybe bread, of course. But a lot of these are still kind of falling into that sometimes food category that have additional fat or sugar or salt that are added to them. Okay. So I think this is where we start to see the processing overlapping with the nutrition aspect of some of the ways that we are processing our food are also adding ingredients that could be contributing to chronic health conditions, could be elevating our blood sugar, our blood pressure, our cholesterol levels, some of those types of things. But some of them are absolutely not, right? Something like tomato extract or tomato paste, adding it to home cooked foods that kind of a neutral, right? It's not really adding or deterring anything. More so we're using it for flavor. Okay, that's group three. So here's group four. Group four is a long list, kind of small up there. I will send you slides too. I'll send you a PDF of my slides afterwards. You're welcome to take pictures, but I will send them as well. Okay, so this is going to be really anything else that we haven't talked about. So this is going to be our snacks that have fat, salt, savory, salty snacks that are added. Things like pretzels, chips, crackers, etc. Packaged meat, fish, and vegetables pre-prepared. So this may be something like, trying to think of a pre-prepared vegetable, like a roasted Brussels sprout that has seasoning and oil added to it and then is frozen, something like that. Cookies, pre-prepared pizza, ice cream, frozen desserts, we've talked about that. Pre-prepared burgers, hot dogs, sausages, things that are already cooked. Candy, any sort of nuggets or fish or sticks, talked about this. Cola, soda, other animal products, energy drinks, packaged bread, hamburger, hot dog buns. Instant soup, noodles, sauces, baked products like baked goods that we might buy. Sweetened and flavored yogurt, breakfast cereal, dairy drinks, including chocolate milk, something that has milk that has something added to it. Infant formulas and drinks, sweetened juices, mixes for pastries, cakes, cake mixes, margarines and spreads, and then certain types of alcohol. So there's a lot of foods on here. One that stands out to me that I find really, really interesting is infant formula. Infant formula is something that is considered an ultra processed food that is also an absolute necessity for us to have, right? For infants, and just for a lot of reasons that I won't dive into. But I think that that's a really interesting example of considering the full picture when it comes to ultra processed foods, right? There's a lot of ingredients in infant formula. Not going to deny that. That is the world that I live in, of looking at formulas, understanding what's happening, that compared to just all the options out there. So no denying that. I've looked at it, I'm like, wow, this is a lot of ingredients. But they're formulated in a way to be precisely what an infant may need, right? Comparing that to some of these other foods that are not necessarily needed, right? They're not foods that we have to eat, or we won't be able to survive. We won't have, any options. However, there are a lot of foods on here that do still have a lot of nutritional value, but save us some time, save us some, could be money and some energy of cooking at home, which is what we're going to talk about. One that really stands out to me is packaged bread, hamburgers, and hot dog buns. And this can include things like bagels, English muffins, all of those kind of bread category. If we go back to this group, Nova Group 3, freshly made unpackaged bread. So this is something that you're going to get like from a bakery, right? If you were to go to a bakery and get a loaf of bread or make bread at home, I suppose, should be the same. That's the difference between Group 3 and Group 4. Likely it's some sort of additive or preservative that is maintaining the shelf life of that bread. And you probably have seen this, right? If you get bakery bread and leave it on the counter, it's going to have mold on it much faster than if we get bread from the grocery store. And so there's pros and cons to that, right? There's pros and cons to purchasing something that maybe doesn't have preservative. Maybe the taste is better. Maybe, we enjoy it more. It's more filling, whatever it is. But we also don't have that longevity of, that bread being able to survive, so to speak, as long as we need it. And then we're talking about food waste and money waste and some of that, right? So this is where I think the unprocessed food conversation is very much an ethical conversation of what is meaningful to you, what's impactful to you, and what choice do we want to make as far as convenience. A lot of these Group 4 foods are convenience foods, right? But there are also foods on there that are somewhat obvious or highly processed, ultra processed foods, something like soda, right? We know that soda doesn't really have anything at all that comes from nature and doesn't necessarily have nutrition benefits, but it can have some other benefits. right? When we put nutritional value aside and we think about things like taste or memories or association with other foods, maybe the caffeine aspect or the kind of pick me up aspect, so to speak. Those are all reasons that all foods fit and reasons that we may choose a food. Again, is this a staple food? Is it a highly nutritious food? No. Is it an ultra processed food? Yes. But does that mean that we should completely avoid it? No. Would I tell you if you're struggling with high blood pressure or high blood sugars that reducing how much sweetened beverages like soda we're drinking is going to help your blood sugar? Yes, I would tell you that. And I would encourage you to do that. But I wouldn't tell you you shouldn't drink that because it's processed. So there's a lot of factors that go into food decisions. Okay. So some of the key takeaways from research, I mentioned this early, most of the studies that we have that are kind of informing those headlines, informing some of the articles and research media coverage that's out there are observational studies. So looking at what people are eating, observing what people are eating in the wild, so to speak, and then forming connections from that. So that may be from interviews, that may be from a food survey. How often do you eat this certain food per week, like a food frequency questionnaire? The hard part with observational studies is number one, remembering, right? If you asked me what I ate for lunch yesterday, I would not know. And I'm sure many of you can relate to that as well. But then we're asking over the past 5 years, how often do you eat these foods? So there's a lot of generalization and honestly what's the word I want to use? Underreporting, right? How often do you eat frozen pizza, right? We're probably going to underestimate how much frozen pizza we eat. Again, a random example. So there's downfalls with observational studies. The other thing is that there are so many factors when it comes to nutrition. What brands of foods are we eating? What are our portion size? What genetics do we have that are changing how we're processing food? What other underlying conditions, chronic conditions? I could go on and on. Observational studies just have a lot of nuances. That's why randomized control studies are the gold standard for studies where participants are given foods in a very controlled setting. But the randomized control studies that are out there, they were eating very, very different diets. So the one group was eating all ultra processed foods, many of the foods from this category, which likely does not represent an average person's diet. Americans do eat a lot of ultra processed foods, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they all look the same. And it doesn't necessarily mean that they are quote unquote unhealthy diets. And then the other group had the less processed or many foods from group one. That also doesn't represent a typical American diet, right? So we kind of see these polarized groups where most people are going to fall in the middle. And so, of course, we're going to see differences. Of course, we're going to see differences in blood levels, in that's probably a lot of what they were looking at were things like blood sugars and blood pressure and cholesterol levels, probably looking at how much sugar and fat was in the blood, like actively in the blood, if it was a short study. Some of you may remember the Super Size Me documentary that came out many years ago. It's probably 25 years old at this point. But that's a good example. He only ate McDonald's for however long it was. I think it was a month, maybe more, and saw drastic changes in his kind of health indicators. That's a really extreme example, but that's similar to kind of what these randomized controlled studies were looking at. Really extreme examples. So there's a lot of limitations and it's challenging to draw conclusions from the studies that we have out there. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the impact on food industry. Food industry, unfortunately, or fortunately, is a big part of what our food supply looks like, right? We are somewhat, controlled by what foods are available and what foods we have access to. So there's a lot of foods that are quote unquote demonized because of their category, right? These foods are bad. We need to avoid these foods. We should never eat these foods. A new survey showed that the food industry was blamed for health problems in the United States. Okay. So a lot of blame is being placed on our food products specifically, and the fact that they are ultra processed, when in fact we know that there are a lot of factors that go into chronic health conditions and health problems in the United States. We may very well start to see ultra processed foods as claims on labels. We're going to talk a lot about labels next week. But this is something that's already been proposed in Europe. You can see an example of what's been proposed here, that it would get a score based on its processing level. Now, I don't necessarily think it's a bad thing to have information presented to us, but I think that there can be a little bit of fear that is developed when we're looking at a food and it gets a negative rating just because of its processing. One of the examples that we talked a lot about in the webinar that I attended were things like meatless products. So soy-based products, or things like veggie burgers, or plant-based products, tofu, another example, all considered ultra-processed foods, all highly nutritious foods that are allowing for alternatives to red meat, which we know has some health implications if we're eating in large amounts. So these are foods that would receive kind of one of these high ratings of ultra processed, when in fact they have a lot of nutritional value. And for certain people, if people are not eating any meat, they're a really valuable source of protein that by eliminating them starts to eliminate opportunity for protein. Okay. And so that starts to show that the more we consider on our labels, the more we limit what foods we're eating, the less options that we have, right? And that becomes stressful and overwhelming, and also limits our ability to get in nutritious foods. The dietary guidelines are put out every year, and the dietary guidelines kind of go through this intense process of proposals and then review and public comments, and are informed by researchers. And then they're put out each year. So the Dietary Guideline Committee was considering ultra-processed food recommendations, but ultimately the scientific review found that there's just limited evidence to make any sort of broad recommendations. The dietary guidelines are meant for everybody, every individual in the United States. Each country, or I think some regions, have their own similar guidelines to the dietary guidelines. They found that there's just not enough information to make any sort of recommendation, which is not typical for the dietary guidelines. If there's enough information, it will go in the dietary guidelines. Cholesterol is a really great example of this. The recommendations have probably changed 5, 6 times in the dietary guidelines because new research comes out and then they update it. So I think it's really telling that they decided not to put anything in the dietary guidelines. It's really telling that the research just isn't there yet to inform health decisions. Some of the research out there that looks at how much of our products are ultra processed, that's probably pretty accurate, right? They can do research on what products are being sold, how processed they are, how many people are purchasing them. But that also goes back to the NOVA classification, that different researchers interpret them differently. And so some of that may show 2 different outcomes. But the food industry may start to see some recommendations for changing. And what ends up happening is the title of things slightly change. So A similar example, they recently banned, the FCA banned red dye number 40. Red dye number 40, I think that's what number it is, by 2027. Okay, so there's these huge lists of products that have red dye number 40 that are going to be taken off the shelves. Most likely by 2027, the food companies will have developed a natural food dye alternative to keep their products on the shelves with very little noticeable difference. So this is what ends up happening, right? We find I'm not going to say loophole because they are removing an artificial color, but for preservatives, we find a natural based preservative. And so then they can say that their food is minimally processed or less processed because they're using a preservative that's found in nature. So then you have the question of like, does it really matter? Does it really matter if we're using a preservative that does the same thing for the food? Doesn't matter if it's found in nature or developed in a lab. And again, I don't have a good answer for you because everybody has a different opinion about that, but the research doesn't support it one way or another, right? Doesn't tell us that these additives or these preservatives, we don't know enough yet. This is maybe something like food dye that we learn more and more, although the evidence isn't super strong about food dye either. A lot of that are also observational studies. Okay, it's a little bit of a tangent, but this is what we see in the food industry, right? We start to see changes that don't really change the food product, but change their ability to have different labeling or remove these labels that are controversial. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the impact on food choices. So when we're categorizing food, using the NOVA categorization, there is no consideration to nutrition at all, okay? And you've heard me talk about this already, and I've given you a little bit of input on viewing those classifications with a nutrition lens. But it is purely a way for researchers to categorize food when they're looking at processing. It's not a way to determine the benefits or the negative aspect of a food. This is where I come in with my nutrition philosophy of fact-based language, right? And removing some of that good or bad, healthy or unhealthy type of language from food. Because if I were to say that food is ultra processed or unprocessed, a lot of times we kind of filter that and hear the same as healthy or unhealthy. Whereas if I were to give you a food example of eating tofu versus eating soybeans, that may come across as equivocal, right? Well, those are both a soy product that have plant-based protein in it that are filling and satisfying and affordable, etc. Okay, so that's where it's really helpful to think about it in real food terms versus thinking about it in categorizations, right? Because we start to associate these words. Again, I think a lot because of media, a lot because like that toxic food one that came up, we start to kind of rewire our brain to think about foods in a certain way. Soy, mushroom, pea proteins, these are all great examples of ultra processed foods that have a lot of really cool benefits and are really innovative. So this is something that the presentation that I went to was a researcher, which I'll talk about her study. I think I have a slide, but if not, I'll talk about it. And somebody from the food industry. So our industry person talked a lot about food innovation and that there's a lot of really cool products that are out there that serve purposes for us in getting nutritious foods in ways that are different and unique and exciting and have availability, maybe affordable, that some of the, critique about ultra processed foods may limit that. So potentially eliminating healthy foods, whether on an individual level or at an industry level, because they're ultra processed. And I think that this is one of the biggest concerns that I have is removing a food that is a staple part of our diet thinking about like a whole wheat bread that you might buy from the store because it's in that ultra processed group, and choosing a less processed, but maybe less nutritious alternative, right? And I think the whole wheat versus a refined grain, or a wheat versus white bread type of thing is a really good example that wheat bread, even if processed, still has more fiber, still is going to be more filling, still has a little bit of protein in it, compared to a refined grain bread that maybe comes from a bakery, while less processed, isn't going to have the same level of fiber and protein and filling power that the whole wheat version might have. So again, that's where you kind of have to make that decision of, what am I choosing this product for? Am I choosing this product for nutrition, for some of the benefits that it provides, or am I choosing it because it's less processed and that's what I want to align with? Neither is bad. There's nothing wrong with either decision. It's just a decision that we make, essentially. But I think it's important to have informed decisions. And that's what kind of guided the title of my talk today. The more that you know, the more that you can control about your food decisions and not feel like the food industry is making decisions for you, or the media is making decisions for you, or even a healthcare provider that you may see, right? Some of you have had a doctor or a healthcare professional that says, choose foods that have 5 ingredients or less. That potentially is going to eliminate some high nutritious foods in favor of foods that are less nutritious. Like my Haagen-Dazs ice cream example has less than 5 ingredients. That doesn't mean that it's a highly nutritious food. Tortilla chips are another great example, right? Corn oil, and salt, 3 ingredients. Is it a health food? Is it going to give you filling, satisfying macronutrients? No, it's not, but it's a minimally processed food. So that's where the more information you have and understanding you have, the easier it is for you to make the best decision for you as an individual. Okay, so this is the study that I wanted to talk about, which I think is really interesting. This comes from the researcher that I was able to listen to, and I do have her article linked in the presentation, so you'll receive that if you want to look at it. It's really, really interesting. So one study showed that the dietary guidelines, which again, talked about the dietary guidelines, can be followed with all ultra-processed foods. 91% of the foods were ultra-processed foods. And this allows for less time in preparation, less money, and the same nutrient quality as if it were minimally processed foods. So just because something is considered ultra-processed or in the NOVA group 4 doesn't mean it's not nutritious, like we've talked about. And just because it is unprocessed doesn't mean that it is nutritious. So this is the breakfast, lunch, and dinner from the study that looked at ultra-processed foods meeting the dietary guidelines. So in addition to giving kind of general statement advice, the dietary guidelines also gives percentage recommendations in grams. This many grams of protein, carbohydrates, whole grains, percentage of calcium, vitamin C, vitamin A, vitamin B, etc. So this meets the dietary guidelines. The only foods that are not ultra-processed foods have a star by them. So the only one on this category here for breakfast is the 1 tablespoon of jam. Is probably a NOVA category 3 because it's fruit and sugar and I guess pectin probably, which is technically a plant product. Okay, so look at some of these and think about maybe what you had for breakfast today, or what is an average breakfast today, right? And I also want you to think about the nutrition value of some of these. I think this is just so interesting. So the first one is a breakfast burrito. Flour tortilla, liquid egg whites in margarine, beans, shredded cheddar cheese, and orange juice. None of those foods jump out as something that's like, oh my gosh, it's so unhealthy. We shouldn't eat that. We're using egg whites, which we know are lower in fat and cholesterol. There's nothing wrong with a whole egg, but just for the purposes, right? It's an ultra processed food because it probably has some sort of stabilizer in it so that it doesn't separate into water and egg white. A flour tortilla. Flour tortilla is staple average food, but that falls into that processed bread category. You can even get whole wheat tortillas, right? But they have some sort of additional additive in them. Canned black beans. Canned foods kind of go into both categories because some canned beans have some sort of stabilizer or something to like prevent that metallic taste or a stabilizer that keeps it fresh for longer or maintains the flavor, you know, some of those types of things. Some do not. Some are purely, you know, the canned vegetable and salt. But many of them do have something else added. Okay, so I think that's a really cool example. Instant oatmeal is another one with raisins, margarine, ultra filtered milk, and apple juice. So you can see that these are really average meals. And all of these have a lot of nutritional value. They have fiber in them. They have protein. They have lots of vitamins and minerals, potassium when we're looking at banana. I don't know why the banana has, oh, it's unprocessed, duh, okay. I didn't do anything to the banana. Whole wheat toast, we've talked about, lots of fiber. But these foods are modified in some way that makes them considered an ultra processed food, but doesn't take away from that nutritional value. Ultra filtered milk, I want to talk about that briefly. This is like a Fairlife milk. It doesn't have, well, it does have, they actually do add lactase to it. So lactate is another example here that would be considered an ultra processed food because it has some sort of substance that's not found in nature. Lactase is, I guess it is found in our bodies because it's an enzyme, but it's not something that we can just get. We can just obtain. So ultra filtered milk has lactase added to it, and then it goes through special processing to remove some of the extra lactose in it. So it's a higher protein, lower sugar, low lactose milk product, but it's considered ultra filtered, or it's considered ultra processed, but it's a high protein option. And it's a great alternative for people who are lactose intolerant. Another example of how food processing can actually have a lot of benefits for us for certain health conditions. Okay, so that's breakfast. Lunch, this looks a little bit small too, but I'll just call out one of these. So let's look at the turkey sandwich. Whole wheat bread, deli turkey, tomato, lettuce, mushrooms, shredded mozzarella cheese, mustard, and then we're doing a frozen grilled potato and sparkling water. That one actually has quite a few unprocessed or minimally processed foods in it, but we still have the whole wheat bread, which is ultra processed. We have the deli turkey, which is ultra processed, both really healthy, staple, convenient foods. And we're able to get a nice balanced as far as taste, as far as macronutrients, food groups, meal. Same thing with taco salad. Taco salad is a really good one because we're using a lot of foods that can be quickly prepared, but may be considered that ultra processed. But when combined with vegetables, we're using a little bit of cheese. We've got some guacamole in there, still including a lot of nutrition. Okay, and then dinner, the one that I want to talk about is the salmon rice bowl. So this is using packets of salmon. Packets of salmon are going to have some sort of stabilizer in them to allow them to be shelf stable in a packet. We're using white rice, scallions, cucumber, sesame seeds, mayonnaise, hot sauce, some seaweed, broccoli on the side, milk on the side. Again, a really colorful, nutritious, easy meal that does have some ultra processed foods in it. I thought that one was a really great example because canned tuna and packets of tuna and salmon are a fantastic lower cost protein option that are highly available, but again, are considered kind of that ultra processed. Okay, so I wanted to show you this to give you an idea of what that research study looks at. And again, meeting the dietary guidelines, meeting the nutrition recommendations without kind of eliminating some of those ultra processed foods. And it would be challenging to do that with some of these meals, right? Looking at that salmon rice bowl, that would mean fresh salmon that we would then have to prepare in some way and buy enough so that we don't have to store it because it's not going to be shelf stable. Making our own mayonnaise or looking for a mayonnaise that has less ingredients that's likely going to be much more expensive. Not using the ultra filtered milk, which, you know, some people are like, okay, fine, I can do the dairy milk. I can't do dairy milk. So that would be, okay, what am I going to replace that with? Likely it's just going to get eliminated. And that's eliminating a protein, calcium, vitamin D source. Okay. So yes, it's doable, absolutely doable, and probably would be the case for a lot of people who would make that choice, but is going to be more expensive, is going to take more time, and may not be, we may not have access to all of those foods. Okay. So those are the considerations that we really want to start to think about, that may be the optimal choice for somebody. And fresh salmon that we prepare, is it going to have a different flavor, different taste, maybe a higher quality taste? Sure, maybe. But if we don't have the time and availability to do that, we're sacrificing the same nutrition because we don't want to use that processed option. Okay, so I want to practice a little bit. Here are some other examples of meals. Let's look at the, let's see. Let's look at the taco. No, I want to look at the soup option because we already did a little bit of a taco. Anybody have any ideas of what about this meal may be ultra processed but still nutritious? Cheese on the salad. Yep. And probably the dressing. Exactly. So cheese is one that there's not really an alternative. It's really an elimination, right? If we don't put cheese on it, we're not making cheese ourselves. I suppose maybe if you go to a cheese shop, but cheese inherently has to have some sort of preservative in it. That's what makes it go from its original form of milk to cheese, is using, I don't know all the components, but rennet and different things to make it into cheese. So that's a great example. And the dressing is good too, because sure, we could make a dressing at home, and sometimes we do, and sometimes we, you know, the taste quality may be a little bit better, but that's not always realistic to be able to get in that nutritious salad. Good. What else? Other thoughts? Spices in the soup. Yep. So the spices in their original form, if we're making the soup from scratch, would be unprocessed. But if we're using some sort of seasoning packet or mix to kind of make that soup base, that would be an ultra processed. And is there a lot of difference between those, right? Between using something that gives us that base for the soup, or maybe we're using some sort of broth or something like that, versus making it all from scratch. And I think soup is a really interesting one because there's a lot of options. There's a lot of in between making it completely from scratch and using some ultra processed foods in there. So this one maybe has sour cream in it, or maybe has some cream cheese, probably has cheese just looking at it, but also looks like it has tons of vegetables, which maybe are frozen vegetables too, which is a minimally processed. Has some meat in it, but maybe it's a canned chicken or a rotisserie chicken. We're still getting a really high quality, high nutrition meal. Okay, let's look at the chicken and sweet potato fry meal. What do we think about this one? Looks good, right? What do we think might be ultra processed but still nutritious in here? Yeah.
It's already been partially fried.
Yep.
So, and probably whatever the crunchy stuff is on the outside of the chicken is processing in it.
Yep, exactly. So the sweet potatoes could be sweet potato fries from scratch, could be, you know, cut and roasted and seasoned, could already be cut and like put in a bag, probably has some sort of agent to keep it from discoloring, but could also be frozen with a breading with oil already partially fried. So again, some options there. Same thing with the breading. The breading, even if we're breading it at home with breadcrumbs, those breadcrumbs probably have some sort of additional seasoning or something in it. But what are we breading? A chicken breast, a lean protein, adding it with a big salad, and then sweet potatoes still are going to have some nutritional value, even if they are a fried option. But shows you that we have some continuum with that. We don't necessarily have to do it completely from scratch. Maybe we're buying a frozen sweet potato that's already been cut or cubed, and then we're adding oil and seasonings and roasting them. Still a shortcut, but not necessarily the ultra processed full, and not even the ultra processed, but the additional fat and salt and oil type of thing. Great. Okay, so the question that's out there is, what about chronic disease? Is ultra processed food contributing to chronic disease or causing chronic disease? Things like heart disease, diabetes, stroke, hypertension. Chronic disease is likely not attributed to just one thing, despite what the media would like us to think and what is written about out there, that this is causing diabetes. This is the reason that we have the highest rates of heart disease, these types of things. We don't know enough about ultra processed foods to make any of these sort of claims. We also want to consider all of the changes in lifestyle that have happened over the past 50 years. Things like transportation, right? We drive and therefore sit a lot more than we walk, or have to go from place to place, get in and out of the car. There are a lot less active jobs, more sedentary lifestyle, drive-through style meals or restaurants, or, options for coffee, different things like that. Stress is a big component. Leading busy lives, right? Not as much time to relax and reflect, and some of these things that we know are also positive for our health. So chronic disease is one that we do in the health profession and in the media and in research. We like to try to find an association. If we can find the cause of chronic disease, we can fix chronic disease. But it's so nuanced and there's so many factors, not even talking about genetics and environment and socioeconomic status, et cetera. So many options, so many things to talk about. But we like that kind of simplicity. If we can figure out what's causing it, then we can figure out how to fix it. Okay, we did pretty good. 25 minutes for questions. So next week we're going to talk about label reading and look at considerations for ultra processed foods and nutrition. Here's my homework for you. I want you to try looking at a food label and categorize it using the NOVA groups, categories 1 through 4. Let me just look at some products at home, see if you can figure out what category it goes in. And then next week, I want you to bring a food label with you. One that you want to talk about, has something interesting about it, or something that you typically eat that you want to talk about. I also will bring some with me, but try to remember to bring a label with you. We'll talk about those. Okay. I would love to take your questions. Thank you so much for your attention.
I have a question. Who funds the NOVA classification system as well as the dietary guidelines?
Okay, so the NOVA classification is independent researchers. I don't know if I can tell you who funded the article, but it is there. If you want to take a look at it, they'll have to disclose their funding. From what I have learned, I don't think that there is a major funding agency, but I don't know 100%. The dietary guidelines is under the USDA. But there are often contributions that come from, big food corporations into the dietary guidelines. Of course. So there are some limitations to that as far as it's individuals, and there's not known major funding, but there are individuals that have bias, I would say, with the dietary guidelines. Good question.
Two beverages. There's a whole group of plant-based milks.
Mhm.
I in particular am addicted to unsweetened cashew milk.
Mhm.
So I'm interested in the nutritional value of that. And then the other thing is there are a lot of drinks now that would be classified as soft drinks. I'll pick one, LaCroix, which has no sugar and it is flavored with essences.
Mhm.
So can you talk about those two things?
Yeah, those are both great. Okay, so plant-based milks. Plant-based milks might be one that it depends. You might want to look at the label because I'm going to guess that most plant-based milks are going to have some sort of, likely an emulsifier to make it so that it doesn't separate, right? Because when you take a nut, when you press it in water, then you have the risk of it separating into, the kind of, I don't know, the puree from the nut, so to speak, and the water. So my guess is that there's some sort of emulsifier. But plant-based milks are fantastic nutritionally for different reasons, right? Not only that they don't contain dairy, so for people who have dairy allergies or for people who are lactose intolerant or are vegan or vegetarian, they also are really filling. They have healthy, plant-based fat in them. However, typical plant-based milks are lower in protein, especially the nut versions. So almond and cashew and oat even is lower in protein. So it depends what you're using it for, right? So if we're using it for a straight alternative to dairy milk, we're likely going to need to add some sort of protein source back. If we're using it as a liquid in, say, a smoothie or maybe with cereal or when baking, it's great alternatives for that. Really good question. There's also plant-based milks like soy milk, and there's pea protein milk that are really high in protein and are a nice alternative to dairy milk. Okay, sparkling water was the other question. I think that is on here. Tap, spring, or mineral water. Distilled alcohol, dairy drinks, energies and sports drinks, cola, other carbonated drinks. Okay, so I'm going to put it in here. LaCroix is carbonated, which means that it has carbon dioxide pushed through it, which is a form of processing. You are right. LaCroix does not have any sugar in it, doesn't have any artificial flavors. It's all natural fruit essence. I always like to say LaCroix is like, they just blow a little lemon or grapefruit onto it. But it would be considered an ultra processed food because we're carbonating it, right? Which is a form of processing. But any of the sparkling waters out there are fantastic alternatives to cola, pop, soda, however you want to call it. So I would never, ever have any qualms about anybody drinking carbonated water or sparkling water, any of the brands that are out there. I love that example. That's a really great example of something that would have that ultra processed food score on it, but the nutrition as far as an alternative aspect is it's a great product. And those are some of the things that we could start to see limited innovation if we start to, regulate ultra processed foods that is technically considered processed because it's carbonated? That's a great question. Thank you.
Your, your presentation is great in terms of talking about healthy choices or maybe healthier choices. How do you take this to the next level in terms of application as we look at our own health practice, motivation coming into play? I won't use the word diet, but developing atomic habits or whatever phrase you want to use so that you can build this into your routine. And are there some enhancements or certain foods that can encourage you, if you include those into your diet, to move more toward a healthier diet? Things like, I mean, I would say, well, if you could put chocolate chips in everything, you'd eat them all, okay? But not necessarily that example, but are there certain things you've seen or research that you follow in terms of the whole notion of motivation to go with a healthier choices?
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I approach it two different ways. The first one that I want to talk a little bit about is combinations of those whole foods, thinking about fruits and vegetables, lean proteins, whole grains, but then using the additions of foods that are convenient, that are easy, that enhance taste. So that's things like, excuse me, the shredded Parmesan here, right? If we were to take the Parmesan off of this, I would not be as intrigued by this salad, right? But with the Parmesan, maybe it has like a garlic, olive oil dressing on it. That's a really appealing food, highly nutritious. Same thing here with this salad, right? We've got, I'm going to say it's tomatoes and mango on it with like a, I don't know, like a bright lemony vinaigrette, something. We're taking something that is highly nutritious, which is a salad, vegetables. Then we're adding some sort of convenience or flavor agent that makes that more appealing. If we were to remove all of the flavor from this dish here, right, we would have a plain chicken breast. We would have a boiled sweet potato or steamed sweet potato, and we would have a salad, probably still with dressing on it, but the salad probably would stay the same. It's just a much less fun and flavorful and, I don't know, just, I want to say the word engaging, but I don't know if food can be engaging, but you know what I mean? Just appetizing meal. So that's my one suggestion, is thinking about how can we make the base of our meals as nutritious as possible while adding in some convenience and making it a little bit easier to stay on track with, right? I think that, not using the word diet, but when we want to make health changes, it's often very all or nothing, right? I'm going to make everything from scratch. I'm going to do everything homemade. I'm not going to do anything that comes out of a package. I'm going to do 5 ingredients or less, whatever it is. And that's overwhelming. You're completely changing your lifestyle and it's hard to maintain that. So making small changes, maybe this salad didn't exist on the plate, right? And we just kind of filled in the gap with more sweet potato fries. So that's one small change of, okay, I'm going to add in some sort of green vegetable or non-starchy vegetable, and that's where I'm going to start. And then you can kind of continually build on that. The other consideration that I would have is when we talk about atomic habits, one of the concepts is habit stacking, right? So thinking about something that we already do, and then how can we build some nutrition into that? So let's say something that we already do is drink coffee in the morning. That's a constant, right? Or we say, okay, I want to try to infuse some nutrition into my morning. I'm going to start with doing some oatmeal with my coffee, right? While I'm making my coffee, I'm also going to make some, quick oats on the stove or in the microwave. So you're taking a habit that already exists that's not changing, not going anywhere, right? Coffee in the morning, not going to go anywhere. And you're going to try to add something onto that, okay? And then all of a sudden that becomes an additional habit that you've created that didn't feel like a huge change. So that's another thought that I would have. Basically, if I were to summarize that, would be to start with small changes and start with small realistic changes. And that's a lot of what I do in my nutrition counseling practice. Where's one place that we can start? Because often, and we know this from research, something like Atomic Habits, that if we start with one small change that's successful, that builds our self-efficacy and confidence, to then add another change. Wow, that felt really good. I felt really good about my ability to do that and the change that I made. I want to do that again, right? It has a built-in kind of reward system. Great question.
You've talked about the food. If you could comment on the preferred timing for these meals and then possibly the percent of calories per meal as far as time of the day?
Yeah, good question. So as far as timing of meals, I will say it varies somewhat, right? There's a lot of conversation out there about intermittent fasting or having longer periods of time before eating breakfast, not eating until noon, those types of things. That works really well for some people, but I find a lot of times those calories are made up somewhere else throughout the day, right? If we're not eating until noon, we're likely eating later into the evening. Or if we're stopping after 6 p.m. or at 6 p.m., we're oftentimes eating a much larger meal in the morning, something like that. So timing really is individualized. I would say that the consensus in research is about every 3 to 4 hours, which ends up kind of lining up with a typical breakfast, lunch, dinner kind of timeline. Same thing with distribution of calories. I always recommend distributing evenly between breakfast, lunch, and dinner, because that's how our digestion really is designed to digest foods in a consistent manner, right? If we're digesting a very small amount and then a very large amount, it's hard for our digestive systems to kind of adjust to that and do that consistently. So if I were to recommend a pattern, that's kind of how I would recommend it. But again, everybody is somewhat unique, and that's where like our routines and our lifestyle, maybe job structure or whatever the schedule is for the day, may determine some of that as well. Yeah.
Just to follow up to the simple steps, the first thing you could do kind of thing. And one thing in our house is my wife wanted more leafy greens, but hates bottle dressings.
Yep.
And she goes, if you can commit, Mr. Cook, to making fresh dressings, we can have a lot more greens. And honestly, fresh dressings are not hard to make. And the 5 ingredients, 10 ingredients, whatever, but it's really easy. And that has worked in our household as that good first step of, and so we've continued. It's not that hard. There's always 2 or 3 fresh dressings in the fridge.
That's great.
And
And that's one of those small things that makes a big difference as far as flavor. And one commitment, but then you've opened up all of these possibilities, right? You have 2 or 3 dressings even. Well, that could be for a taco salad. That could be for a side salad. That could be for, maybe you're going to do like a spinach salad or a kale. Like you could do all different types of things, not just like lettuce with dressing and cucumbers. You know what I mean? Like you just have a lot of options. And I do agree. Dressings are one of those convenience types of things, but homemade dressing is definitely superior when it comes to taste. I would agree with. Thank you. That's a great suggestion.
What is ultra filtered milk?
Mhm.
I just started buying that only because I don't like to drink milk a lot, but this tastes a little bit better. It's a little bit more expensive. Is this okay, or is this processed, or?
Yeah, that's a great question. Ultra filtered milk, Fairlife, or I just saw a new brand that came out. I forget the name of it, but Fairlife is the most common. Fairlife, yep. So essentially what they do is they take the dairy milk and put it through, if you think about, this is kind of an exaggeration, but if you think about like a sieve or a filter system with holes in it, but they do it at a very small microscopic level, they're doing additional filtering so that some of the lactose or the sugar is taken out, but all of the protein remains. So I think the difference is like 9 grams of protein to 12 grams of protein or something like that. And then the carbohydrates are, I don't know, maybe 6 or 7, 8 compared to 15. So they're cutting the sugar in half, adding a little bit more protein back. And that's where some people find milk very sweet. And so Fairlife is sometimes a little bit more appealing because some of that sugar is taken out. I like Fairlife milk a lot for people who have lactose intolerant and can't tolerate milk, don't like milk, or want a little bit of a higher protein option. So it's fantastic. It's considered an ultra processed food because of that processing, but has a lot of kind of additional benefits or cool benefits to it. So that's what I drink at home. And that's what, I wouldn't necessarily recommend it unless that's what we were talking about. I don't like the taste of milk, or I want more protein, or, I don't want to do a protein drink, but I want to do, I want something that has a little bit more protein. That's Fairlife is a great option, or ultra processed or ultra filtered milk is a great option. Thank you.
I have a question. I have a lot of friends that talk about having a protein shake instead of a meal. Is that healthy?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, good question. So protein shakes, another one that are on that ultra processed, actually combined with infant formulas. So I think that meal replacement shakes or protein shakes are a nice, convenient option for a meal alternative, but they're oftentimes not enough calories, right? They're 150 to 300 calories, maybe. So it's not necessarily going to give that long lasting filling power that a full breakfast might give, but they're an excellent source of protein, especially for people who don't like eggs or don't want to do, eggs are really kind of a big protein source for the morning. Protein shakes are a nice way to fill that gap, but I always encourage adding some sort of carbohydrate, whether it's fruit or some sort of whole grains, to kind of fill that gap. So I would say that it's not a balanced meal. It doesn't give you all of the macronutrients that we might need, but they're a great protein source. And there's a lot of options for those out there nowadays.
Related to that, how about juicing? Not necessarily as a meal substitute, although it could be, but maybe a mid-afternoon in lieu of a snack where you're just getting vegetables and fruits and putting them through a blender and then drinking that, just to make sure you're getting the nutrients you need for the day.
Yeah, good question. So there's a big difference between juicing and blending, or like making a smoothie. So with juicing, you're putting the fruits and vegetables through and you're getting the juice out, but then what remains is all of this pulp, right? And that's all of the fiber. So all of the fiber is really where that filling, satisfying part of fruits and vegetables come from. Whereas if we're blending them, making a smoothie type drink, you're keeping all of that fiber intact. So I always recommend smoothies over juicing. Yeah, because you're maintaining that fiber. You also have the opportunity to put some milk or yogurt or something that combines the carbohydrate and protein. Is a fantastic snack, a great way to kind of combine the carbohydrate, protein, macronutrients, which is usually what I recommend for snacks. Yeah, great.
Any more questions? Oh, one more. Okay.
Not to exaggerate, but if you skin a rotisserie chicken, you can make a million things out of it. But people say rotisserie chicken isn't good for you.
So that's where some of the processing really it's going to have additional additives, preservatives in it. That's just kind of how it becomes a rotisserie chicken versus a roasted chicken. But I agree with you that it's a fantastic convenience option because you can make a bunch of things with it. They are typically pretty affordable. They are readily available, and it is a lean source of protein, right? That doesn't go away just because we may have some preservatives in it that allow it to be what it is. That doesn't take away from the nutritional value. So those are something that added in variety of meats, right? We want to have all different types of meats, not just rotisserie chicken, bacon, deli meats. Which I still think the rotisserie chicken is a little bit more of a leaner protein than those, but we also want to have fresh fish and poultry and red meat. But yes, and I think that's a good example of one of those foods that we're choosing some convenience, knowing that it's going to be considered an ultra processed food because it allows us to get a nutritious meal in much shorter period of time. And I think even one of these dinners had a rotisserie chicken. Yeah, rotisserie chicken, mixed greens, sweet potatoes, peas, and a whole wheat dinner roll, right? So we're using we're using that as our protein source, but then we're combining it with really the rest of it is all vegetables. They just maybe are canned, or the mixed greens is interesting. It must have some sort of like something that keeps it from wilting if they're like in a bag or something like that. So yeah, a great option.
I guess we're at the end of our program here today. Thank you so
Great.
much, Emily.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
We look
Thank
forward to,
you.
look forward to next week and learning how to read those labels and
Yes.
make some healthy choices. Thank
Sounds
you.
great. Bring a label with you.